Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook. I'm here to talk about the season finale of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It was called Equality of Mercy. As it starts, Pike is cooking again as Enterprise is tending to Outpost 4 with another starship, and he visits with his old lady friend, Captain Person, who's there. Pike is then introduced to the son of the commander of Outpost 4 at a meeting aboard Enterprise, and realizes that he's one of the people who dies in his future accident, and kind of freaks out and has to leave the room. He goes to his quarters where he starts recording a note for the boy, seemingly for the purpose of telling him what his future is going to be. While he's in the process of this, he is suddenly met by a surprise visitor in his quarters, which turns out to be a future version of himself, wearing a rubbered up Khan era uniform, AKA the Monster Maroon uniform, and I almost fell off the couch. Wow. They recreated the uniform pretty faithfully. The only difference I could really see was that they rubbered up the arms. They put that rubber on them like they have on the shoulders of the current uniforms on the show, which I didn't love, but it is an alternate. This is a version of Pike from an alternate future, so I guess it's fine. But wow, did he look great in it, and was it great to see the Monster Maroons on TV? Just amazing. Anyway, future Pike has to convince present Pike that he's him. And so he tells him a story about his first horse, which didn't end well, and which nobody else knows. And then present Pike references the fact that it's a tragic backstory, which is hilarious because something some of the fans have been picking on is that these characters all seem to have tragic backstories on Discovery and whatnot, and this show. Anyway, future Pike tells present Pike that he's going to screw up the future if he writes that letter, and lets him touch a Klingon time crystal that he was given so that present Pike could see what happens when he changes the future, which is apparently that he continues on as captain of the Enterprise and isn't replaced by Kirk for the events of Balance of Terror, which include the almost wedding from that episode, which they created almost word for word, or recreated almost word for word. Spock is his first officer now, of course, and he also behaves very differently, which makes sense because he's matured since his early days with Pike. When Pike tells Spock what's going on, he does a mind meld where he sees the future that Pike saw, and then tells him that the accident has already happened and that no one was hurt. Moments later, the events at Outpost 4 from Balance of Terror begin to take place. And once again, they recreated this scene, the initial engagement scene from that episode, almost shot for shot and word for word. There were subtle changes that connected the scene to, for example, the fact that Pike knew that the commander of Outpost 4 had a son. But other than that, it was move for move, shot for shot, word for word recreation, and it was very cool just to see the dedication that they put into it, and to see Pike react to everything that Kirk experienced in the original Balance of Terror episode, in the original situation. Soon enough thereafter, somehow the Enterprise is met by the USS Farragut under the command of Captain James T. Kirk. Kirk suggests that they both shadow the Romulan ship, which is exactly what he did when in command of the Enterprise in Balance of Terror. Before Kirk can come aboard the Enterprise for, a strategy meeting, Pike consults Sam Kirk in his ready room about his brother, and he gives an accurate description of him, including the fact that he doesn't like to lose, which I thought was cool. Just after this, the crew gets a glimpse of the Romulan bridge, just as they did in Balance of Terror, and of course, everyone's eyes turn to Spock. Of course, the reason for this is that no one has seen a Romulan before, just as was the case in Balance of Terror, and when they see them for the first time and realize that they look like Spock, they kind of freak out, which is exactly what happened in Balance of Terror. Anyway, there's a strategizing meeting that takes place next between Kirk, Pike, Dr. Mbenga, Ortegas. Spock is there, and it's a recreation of the strategizing session that took place in Balance of Terror, and almost the same conversation is had, which is interesting because they're working with a couple of different characters. The two captains decide to follow almost the same strategy that Kirk followed in Balance of Terror, except using two ships instead of one. The Romulans then show up and fire on the Farragut, which is badly damaged. Enterprise returns fire to draw them off and ends up getting hit with a plasma weapon, but from a distance, so it doesn't do as much damage. The crew of the Farragut is beamed aboard Enterprise, and we learn from a newly arrived La'an that Una is not able to communicate with anyone for some reason. She's not allowed to have contact, but we don't know why. Kirk then reads Pike the riot act for hesitating to fire after Farragut was first fired upon, which he surmises means that Pike is hesitant to take risks, which in Kirk's estimation is a bad thing in this situation. Pike then decides to go for broke and extend an olive branch to the Romulans, which lead to a very interesting conversation and a 2-hour ceasefire. The Romulan sub-commander sees the olive branch's weakness and urges his commander to go hard after Enterprise, which the commander resists, as he would prefer to take the time to make repairs to engines and weapons, both of which they may need in top form. Back aboard Enterprise, Pike and Spock have a conversation about what's been happening, and we learn that Una is in prison because she was found out as an augment. Spock goes to oversee the repairs to, I guess, phaser control, and this leads to us seeing Spock working in the Jeffries tube and having a conversation with the ship's engineer, whom we never exactly see, but whom happens to have a particular Scottish brogue. And the actor that played the engineer with the Scottish brogue is a guy named Matt Wolf, who does a lot of voiceover work. Anyway, Pike and Kirk have a conversation, and Kirk suggests some kind of gambit that involves him borrowing a shuttle to make it seem as though the Federation had sent reinforcements. The ceasefire ends, and there's another conversation between Pike and the Romulan commander, immediately after which a whole freaking bunch of Romulan ships show up just on the other side of the neutral zone border, despite the fact that the commander did not call them because the sub-commander did. This pisses off the commander kind of a lot, and he explains that he disapproves of this because he would like to avoid war, seeing as he's old enough to remember a time when there was no war. Enterprise is hailed by the Romulan flagship, commanded by the Praetor, who is a woman, who threatens Enterprise with destruction if it doesn't surrender immediately, after which a whole bunch of Federation ships show up, and we soon learn that they are all mining drones that Kirk went and got, figuring that the Romulans wouldn't realize they aren't battleships. Pike then has another terse conversation with the Praetor, and she seems to stand down, but then orders the commander of the Warbird, which Uhura and Spock mistakenly refer to as birds of prey, to stand for destruction as punishment for failing, I guess. And he talks to Pike just before, and the conversation is similar to the one that he had with Kirk in Balance of Terror, just before he blows up his own ship. It turns out that the Praetor wasn't standing down, and she still wants Enterprise to surrender. When Pike orders Enterprise to leave, it is somehow unable to move at warp, and so Kirk decides to provide them with cover to escape by maneuvering the drones between the fleet and the Enterprise. The Romulans attack, and the Enterprise avoids destruction, but is badly damaged just as it was in Balance of Terror, and this time, the bride from the almost wedding is killed instead of the groom. And Spock, who was overseeing repairs to the phaser control room, is very badly wounded with massive radiation burns and the loss of part of his leg, seemingly in a way that approximates what would otherwise have happened to Pike in the accident. Present Pike and future Pike have another conversation, and during the conversation, future Pike picks a picture up off of the shelf in Pike's quarters, and it's a picture of Pike and April, I guess when Pike was given command of the Enterprise, and they're wearing uniforms similar to those worn in The Cage. And it drives me crazy because I want to know when in the uniform progression that happened. We know when it happened, but like when, like what, how are they now fitting that in? Like at what point did they wear the Discovery uniforms? Anyway, like, you know, it just goes to show you they know that they wore those uniforms during that period, but they didn't care enough to make that the case when they did Discovery. Anyway, they're talking, and future Pike says that the war is still going on, and that in his time, and that no matter what they do in every timeline, it ends with Spock dying. And the suggestion is that by saving the people from the accident, Pike swaps his fate with Spock's, and Spock ends up being hurt the way he was hurt, but because of different events. Back in the future timeline, Kirk and Pike have a conversation about how things might have been different, and then they move to talking about Kirk when Pike asks him to tell him about himself. Back in the present, Pike decides not to send the letter he was writing. Spock then visits Pike as he's looking at Kirk's record, and they talk about implications for the future of Pike having realized that his particular future that he saw and his accident is probably inescapable. But he talks about how he's happy for it because he'd rather endure it than pawn it off on someone else. And during this conversation, Spock kind of realizes that he's the someone else. Before the episode ends, Pike's girlfriend, Captain Lady Friend, shows up to arrest Una for violating the whole genetic modification thing. And when Pike tries to stop her from being hauled off by grabbing one of the Starfleet security red shirts, she tells him not to fight it because she knew it could happen at some point. And before the, and then Pike tells his girlfriend, lady friend, Captain Person, that this isn't over. And that's where it ended. I thought this episode was fantastic. I think it's a great season ender. I just, for multiple reasons. One, the cliffhanger. Two, they did some epic stuff. I just found it genius. I had just watched Balance of Terror before because I knew they were going to do something with the Romulans and I wanted to brush up on the Romulan Federation First Contact so I would know whether or not they screwed it up. And they totally did not, because they recreated it and involved the Romulans in the episode, but only in an alternate future setting. So it didn't change anything about the canon, which is fantastic. And as I said, just the whole idea of seeing a slightly different crew deal with those same events was really cool. And having Kirk be part of it, but as the captain of a different ship, and to watch him make the same exact moves and suggest the same exact moves for most of what he does in the episode that he does in the original episode was really, really cool, because it just shows that the character is consistent. This is what he did when he was commanding the Enterprise, and this is what he suggests doing when he's not. And I just thought that was really cool. The writers really watched that episode. They got it, and they carried it over, I think, into its own alternate future in this episode perfectly. They just did a great job. It was fantastic. I could not have been happier with it. Seeing future Pike in the Monster Maroon, like I said, was amazing. Knowing that Ethan Peck played Spock differently because he's more mature was amazing, because he could just as easily have not done that. And it just highlights how he's doing a good job with the character. I thought that it was great that it sort of took the Pike arc that we've been sort of seeing play out over the season to yet another point where he basically says, you know what, I'm not going to fight fate, because he's gone back and forth. But now he seems committed to, okay, I'm seriously not going to fight it anymore, because I know what's going to happen if I do, and I don't want those side effects. So I thought that was cool. They just started out the season with him struggling with it, and now at the end, he sort of seems to have made a real peace with it. And you couldn't ask for anything more. That they bookended it. And this isn't to say they won't deal with it again, but they've at least sort of bookended it. And you have to give them credit where credit is due. That's brilliant. And, they worked in the whole thing about Una. They planted that seed right early in the season where she turns out to be an augment. And so now that whole story is a chicken coming home to roost. I think that's 2 reviews in a row where I've used that analogy. But they've planted seeds and they're bearing fruit. And that's great, because one of the critiques of episodic television that Star Trek fans would make to me when I would say that I hated the story arc thing on Discovery is that episodic TV has its flaws too, in their view, where it plants seeds but then nothing comes of it. Like we had literally Space Seed, right, in the original series. And if not for Star Trek II, they never would have dealt with that again. And there are a ton of other things that happen that way on Star Trek. Some stuff gets revisited, like on Next Gen, they revisited stuff, and Deep Space Nine too. But episodic TV largely stays away from that stuff if it's strictly episodic. And this show has done a great job of weaving the arc in without making the arc the central thing that they deal with every stinking episode. And they've been able to bring us great standalone stories. So I think they've done a fantastic job, now that the season on the whole is concluded, of doing both of those things, making the show episodic and great in that way, and also sort of serializing it with the B plot in the background in a way that had a beginning, middle, and end on multiple fronts. That is not easy to do. And I think they handled it excellently. Just another example, I now find myself glad that they invented time crystals out of nowhere back on Discovery, season 2, because in this episode, they use them again, and it makes sense that they exist now, because we knew about them already, whereas when they first came out in Discovery, we're like, what are you talking about? But now they reuse them, and it works perfectly to make this story possible. And if they hadn't done that crazy thing, you know, before, they would have pulled it out of their ass here, and it would have sort of ruined it. So I'm actually glad that they pulled it out of their ass on Discovery, because Discovery's trash anyway, and it makes sense here. So I thought that was great. The only critique I would have about this episode, really and truly, is I don't like the guy that plays Kirk. I don't like the guy that plays Kirk. You know, I don't want him to stand there and do a Shatner, like, you know, Captain Pike, why did you do that? I thought we should have done that instead. You know, I didn't want to do that whole thing, but he didn't have Kirk's swagger at all. He didn't have Shatner's swagger at all. He didn't have Kirk's gravitas at all, and I think that's unfortunate. And I don't know how much of that has to do with the writers, but I think they got everything else right, so I'm hesitant to blame them. I want to blame it on this actor. So yeah, not good. I thought the whole thing where you hear that engineer's voice was pretty cool, and I thought for a minute we were going to get a Dr. McCoy appearance, because he's brought up at one point, not Dr. McCoy, but the ship's doctor. But we don't, there's no audio or visual cameo of a Dr. McCoy in this episode, which is kind of a bummer, but I guess it could always happen, right? Here's the question. What are they going to do with Kirk in season 2? Because that's what they've said, right? That he's going to be in season 2. And now we've seen him at the end of season 1. So is he still going to be in season 2? And is he going to be a captain? Like, because he shouldn't be. But there are set photos with him with the captain's things on, so I don't know. He's been seen in pictures with La'an, but she's in her red uniform, not the yellow one that she wears in this, so I don't know. Are we going to actually see him in season 2? Who knows? That might have been a red herring, but we'll find out when the show comes back. But once again, to wrap up, I thought this was a fantastic episode. I think they hit all the right notes. I think they hit notes I never could have thought they would have hit, or never would have conceived of them hitting. They surprised me. They wowed me. They thrilled me. This was just a fantastic, fantastic episode that paid, I think, great homage to one of the best episodes of the original series without screwing anything up. Which, like, I can't tell you what an accomplishment this is, in my view. Fantastic. So cheers to this episode. Cheers to the season. You know, which is not to say I haven't had issues. I have. I've not liked how they've characterized Spock all the time. But on balance, I think this was a great season, and I'm looking forward to season 2. For now, I'm going to get out of here. I'll be back with more content very soon. Until then, I wish you peace and long life.